And so when we're talking about actually designing a space, which is what we're here to talk about, again, this isn't a how-to, but we're going to go through generally how I think about designing a space, really from a sort of abstract level into some very specific case studies. And so the work doesn't just show up. The mindset we bring in, the experiences, and our own preferences that we bring to a project, the drawings are a result of sort of working through all of that. And when we look at the current climate, even business schools, this is the D school at Stanford, where they're taking sort of design thinking, as they call it. We are all designers, and that's great. IDEO, another product design company, they do this really well as well. They sort of categorize things into these phases, and I do think that there's a lot of value in that, in the sense that, especially when you're working with teams, especially when you're working with people who are sort of process oriented, like in different companies, this makes a lot of sense. But to me, I think it's actually even more simple than that. So this is a image of the Don't Look Up movie. They talk about Carl Sagan in this, the idea of first principles, where Einstein and Sagan were able to make very complicated things into boiling them down into first principles in a very sort of genuine way, where that's what allows you to understand things in a new way, is not being distracted, not being confused, not being sort of pulled away down traditional roads, by sort of really, really uncovering and reverse engineering things in a way that does let you get to first principles. And the reason why I say that, and the reason why I think that is really critical for developing interesting and world-class building projects, is because aesthetics isn't the place that I like to start. Aesthetics are very individual preferences, and it's really difficult to talk about that. You're all different people. You might like a purple car, you might like a white car. It doesn't really matter. The point is that it's all very different. Squares, triangles, it doesn't matter. It's difficult to have a conversation about what's better when there's not a goal that's a deeper goal that we actually are using as a filter. So, for instance, when I ask students to present their buildings in design studios, I'll often ask them to do it without talking about what it looks like. So tell me what it's doing. I can see what it's looking. I can see what it looks like. And those two things together, when we basically cross-reference them, that is what gives you basically like an area that you can produce critique, an area where you can decide, is it doing what you're saying it's doing? Is the thing we're looking at meeting the goal that you're actually trying to achieve? And that's why it's not that aesthetics isn't important. And that's why I love this Buckminster Fuller quote, because he's talking about how it's not that aesthetics isn't important. He says, when I'm working on a problem, I never think about beauty, but when I'm finished, if the solution is not beautiful, I know it's wrong. What I get out of this is that he's talking about delaying the judgment of aesthetics. So it's not that it's not important, it is incredibly important. If you're building a project, you're probably spending several $1 million. You probably should care about what it looks like so that you like it. It's not that it isn't important, it's that if you don't start with something deeper, it's too surface, it doesn't have enough depth. If we're just talking about what something looks like, there's not enough depth there to really engage as much as I think is needed to develop a project in a more meaningful way. And so how do we go about doing that? This is an image that I think is pretty relevant, and it's an album cover. It's about pulling, a white light apart into its different constituent layers. And what Newton was really able to do, though, is also show that you can not only take white light, pull it apart, but use a mirror and actually put it back together. And so he's taking the white light, separating it with a prism, putting it back together again with a mirror or a lens, pulling it, redirecting it with a prism, and then pulling it apart again. And so this sort of taking something and pulling it apart, putting it back together, pulling it apart, putting it back together, that really is how I think of designing things, because we do have to sort of pull it apart to be able to understand it, but then it does have to go back together. So all of that stuff is baked in there, whether or not it's explicit or whether or not it's really super visible in the final iteration. And so one analogy that I do like to use is this writer-director. We all have our own favorite writers, directors, artists. A big part of why we love them is because they have an authentic voice. That voice is developed from their life, from their experiences, from their education, who they've worked with, say in this case, other movies they've made. Whatever it is, these are individuals or maybe small teams, but there is an authentic voice that is coming through that does not resonate with everybody, and that's perfectly fine. I don't expect my voice to resonate with everybody, and that's perfectly fine. But what I am trying to do, and what I think these folks are trying to do, is have an authentic voice that they have a real sort of passion behind, and it makes a lot of sense to people. So, for instance, if a Tarantino movie comes out, I actually don't want to know much about it at all. I just want to go see it because I appreciate his position in terms of where he's coming from. And in his particular case, the reason I use him as an example is specifically because he actually does know all of the technical aspects as well. And so he can be the hipster filmmaker, or he can be the brooding writer who's, putting the script together, by himself with a small team, whatever it is. And then when it comes to actually executing the larger project, there's a much bigger group that is required on the set. And very importantly, he's still involved. He still is participating to keep that vision, that authentic voice that was developed in the script, keep it on track even as the set and the crew expand significantly. And in his case, he'll jump into different roles. He'll be an actor. He can look through a camera and understand what's going on, because even though he may not be the filmer on a larger movie like this one, he does know what he's looking at. And why that's important is because that means he's not middle management. That means he's not just telling other people what to do. He's able to work with people because he actually knows what is possible. And certainly hiring people that are better than us at certain things is important, but having a degree of technical expertise is really important. So in my case, I'm an architect, I'm a contractor, I've done owner's representation work on site. It doesn't really matter. The point is that all of that is a base of information that I can pull from when I'm talking to these different people, even though they might be checking that box, from a sort of responsibility role. And so, his involvement in projects is far beyond just writing a script and handing it over. It's making sure on many, many levels across many different disciplines that the vision and that authentic voice that has been developed is being executed as fully and across as many levels as is possible. And so when we have a script, that's really where it is starting. It's this passionate voice, this authentic voice, not a committee, something that we actually really care about and is intriguing, and it gets worked out, it gets tested, it involves more people, test reads, whatever it is. Because if it's not good, then really we're just putting lipstick on a pig. And that's the problem when our script isn't good, is that it has a ceiling that's a lot lower because we're really just polishing something that doesn't have as much potential in it because it doesn't have as much depth to it or interest in it. And one of the ways that I like thinking about this is as a jazz trio. And why do I like this example? These individuals, any three of us could get up and grab these instruments and start banging around, but that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that these people are coming to the stage with a whole lifetime of experience, practice, who else they've played with, their own preferences in terms of other music they like, even the technical tools of their own instruments. These are very particular things that are set up in their own unique ways. And all of that knowledge, all of that practice, all of that technical expertise, none of that is actually being discussed here, which is again why, even though I've got my different sort of backgrounds and certifications, that's not what we talk about. What really matters in an image like this with a jazz trio is what is the final result. But that final result is not possible at a high level, at a world-class level, without having a very strong base of understanding and technical knowledge and an ability to work with other people. This whole thing, making and developing projects, is a team effort. When I say that it starts with a small group, that's really anticipating that there is a much bigger team that needs a very, very specific core to be focusing on as the project moves along. And another example of that would be in an interview with Harvard Business Review, Deepak Chopra talks about the sort of self-help world, and the interviewer is asking him about that. And his comment is that, yeah, there's a lot of people out there who may or may not be as helpful, but I'm also a medical doctor, and he's practiced, he has run institutes. He's bringing these credentials that are that's not important necessarily for treating patients, especially if he's writing books or doing, things like that he does a lot of now. But those are the foundation that allows him to understand, the processes of working, the processes of developing research, whatever it is. It's this lifetime, decades of experience that are setting the groundwork for what he's doing now. And that's, again, why I like these as analogies for what I do. And in the best case scenario, a very small team is able to make a lot of noise. So, a three-piece band can make a ton of noise if you have the right experience, if you have the right technical sort of basis, and if you are working together in an efficient way. You can make a ton of noise as a very small team, and that's really the goal. And that's why when I talk about setting things up with clients, this is a diagram that I use, because what we're really trying to do here is work in this beginning phase. This is where we're dreaming up our projects, because these projects really are dreams. These are projects that are ambitious. They should be things that have been stuck in your mind for a long time. We work on these early concepts. We do test fits. We do prototypes. We try feasibility studies, whatever it is, and we develop it to a concept and a schematic design degree of detail, which is pretty early, but that is enough to have a very clear draft or a very clear script of what the future project will be, because that's the framework that we then use as you, again, eventually begin to document and then eventually begin to build the project. And so why do we do it this way? Part of the reason that I think we do it this way is because we're basically delaying the amount of money that needs to go out the door that is significant until you get to a certain point where you're convinced that the project should go forward and it's worth spending, a lot more money, 6 figures on documenting a project with a bunch of local professionals. This is how commercial development groups do this that are in-house to a larger company. When I was running teams like this, we do this work in-house because, first of all, we have a tremendous understanding of what we're trying to do. We understand the shorthand of the business in terms of what works, what doesn't work. We don't have to play telephone with outside professionals. We have a very small team internally that works very quickly to do test fits, concepts, test business model assumptions, whatever it is, to work very, very quickly so that by the time we get to this documentation phase, it's really about just running to the finish line. And that's why I work this way with private individuals and companies, is because that way of working allows us to be very, very nimble, very lean, very efficient, less communication issues up and down the line, so that we have that script, and that's how we really develop it in an efficient way. And so as we move forward, one of the reasons why that is so important is because when people start doing business model planning, a lot of times they will actually, try to work on the business model and the funding together. And this gap can lead to missed assumptions. It can have sort of major issues that actually aren't really known until you start doing the blocking. And so my preference is to be really looking at the space planning and the business modeling very, very close together. And the reason for that is because if you can get the business model and the spatial planning and the visualizations really working together, it becomes a much more clear story that you're trying to sell to someone, that you're trying to get support for, whether it's from a building department or a zoning hearing or just getting money for your project. when you can sell and show a business model and images that are both extremely compelling and work, meaning they're not, a budget that's way off or designs that aren't really feasible, that's a great way to go about getting support. And so that's why, the drawings that I make are really tools. They're not just pretty pictures. That's not enough. They have to be tools that actually significantly advance your project forward. And so when we move, when I look at this development life cycle, I break it out into different phases. It's not always this direct in terms of how it goes, but the way that we actually break it up in terms of design is that the design is really this sort of middle chunk. There's a whole lot of work that goes into this that is about project organization, early phase, high value planning, finding spaces, and then eventually construction. This focus of this talk is going to be much more on design, even though development overall encompasses a lot more than that. I do offer workshops and things like that that are more encompassing of the rest of this, meaning the early involvement in the building. But for this talk, we're going to be focusing much more specifically on design.